Episode 20, Spirituality. In this episode, we're going to start to look at spirituality, a topic area that gets to the heart of every religious tradition. It is crucial for understanding how and why Christian theology evolves the way it does. And it is crucial for dialogue and encounter. It creates a bridge between the experience of Catholic Christianity and the experiences of other people of faith. Before we look at the spirituality revealed in the New Testament, let's be a little bit more specific about what we mean here by the term. Spirituality as a topic area explores the religious experience of a faith community. It pays attention to language in which that experience is expressed, the symbols and stories that shape the religious imagination, and the practices through which members of the community engage with the transcendent. It pays careful attention to the affective dimension of experience, what it feels like to engage in prayer, meditation, or rituals. It also attends to the inner dispositions and attitudes which habitually shape the inner space of the worshipper. It will have from the outset a working theory of the human person, of the transcendent, and of the cosmos, though that may get modified in the process of investigation. The study of spirituality from within a tradition will develop such working theories out of the existing language and sensibilities of the tradition. This makes for a feedback loop. Religious experience shapes the understanding of reality, and the theory of reality in turn gives a framework for the experience of the community. This is part of the process that generates theology. To take a personal example, I am a Jesuit, and the spirituality of my religious order is drawn from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. These exercises provide a practical pathway into a Christian experience of God. However, that pathway is encoded in a theological language inherited and modified through the centuries of Christian religious experience, and which continues to be modified. But we can also look at a tradition from outside. In this case, we do not necessarily share the same working theory of those relations between self, world, and the divine as those who live within it. Nevertheless, the view from outside can be helpful to those within a tradition. Examples of such an approach are William James's early 20th century classic, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James is agnostic about specific metaphysical claims, but he has no problem with recognizing the authenticity of religious experiences as a human phenomenon to be taken seriously. In our own era, when technology allows us to map brain activity, there is a lot of interest in the neurology of religious experience. William James concentrated on the experience from the inside, on first-person reports. Interested neuroscientists work on the outside, on what is happening in the brain. They can establish that at least some forms of religious experience are a physical reality as well, which at least tells us that they are a fact of life. All these are things we'll come back to in later podcasts. For now, we just want to see if we can get a sense of what religious experience felt like on the inside for the followers of Jesus, as presented in the writings of the New Testament. We can begin simply with the prayer that Jesus gave his disciples, the Our Father, and the instructions that go with it. The prayer places the worshipper in symbolic space directed towards a person, in a relationship with the feel of filial dependence. But that symbolic space also shapes the will and desire of the praying person. There is fealty and surrender to the will of the Creator. Thy will be done. An alignment of my personal will with the Creator's plans for the new world order. May thy reign come. Personal requests are simple. Ask for food for the day. Ask for forgiveness, though only insofar as we forgive others. Ask not to be put to the test. Ask to be protected from evil. Do not approach God with a shopping list. Enter into prayer with the attitude of humble hope and readiness to accept the will of God. Have a fundamental attitude of trust in God's goodness and grace. There is a tension with Jesus' other sayings on prayer: ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find. The resolution may be that if all those prayer dispositions are right, then there is a harmony of the will. The properly praying person will not ask for things that God does not intend to grant. That seems to be the point made rather brutally in the letter of James. There, the author gives his readers a hard time for asking for the wrong things. You ask and do not receive, because you ask badly, for things you can use for your pleasure. So a fundamental element of prayer is about entering into a familiar relationship with the God of creation and salvation, in an attitude of humility, trust, and gratitude, both accepting and seeking God's will. The Synoptic Gospels, and especially Luke's Gospel, give us glimpses of Jesus himself at prayer, alone and intense. In John's Gospel, where the relationship with the Father is a central theme of the drama, the author gives a much fuller impression of the content of Jesus' inner life through long soliloquies, and the whole of chapter 17 is devoted to Jesus' prayer to the Father on behalf of the disciples. However, we only really hear two articulations of his prayer in the Synoptic Gospels. One is a prayer of praise. He praises the Father for revealing the truth, not to the wise and learned, but to the simple. The other is a prayer of supplication. We hear him in the Garden of Gethsemane, begging to be spared the suffering that awaits, but in the end, accepting God's will. Such prayer, modelled by Jesus, embedded in an immediate personal relationship with God, does not come from nowhere. We find it in the personal testimonies of the prophets, especially Jeremiah. And there is a rich language for personal dialogue with God in the Psalms, a constant prayer resource for the Jewish faithful. These range from praise of God the Creator to celebration of the God who saves his people, to personal pleas for help in time of terror and threat. They are filled with a language of desire and longing. The longing to encounter the presence of God in the temple. The longing to draw close to the light and wisdom of God through obedience to the law. But there is also a ritual framework for prayer in the Jewish tradition within which Jesus' movement emerged. A constant reference point in the Gospels is the temple. In very different ways, the early chapters of Luke's Gospel, the letter to the Hebrews, and the book of Revelation give us a sense of how important the temple was in mediating a sense of sacred presence to the worshippers of Jesus' time. The theme is articulated in the Psalms, many of which reference temple liturgy directly. Psalm 84 speaks of the joy of pilgrims approaching Jerusalem to worship. Psalm 121 articulates a longing to encounter the power and glory of God in the sanctuary. Such an experience of sacred place, sacred space, is of course common to many religious cultures. The experience of entering holy ground, as described in Exodus chapter 3, where Moses encounters God in the burning bush, can be found in the Greek playwright Sophocles. Indeed, within the Jewish territories of Jesus' time, the temple was not the only sacred precinct. Herod the Great paid tribute to the sacredness of the area around the Oak of Mamre, site of an encounter between Abraham and God, by building a wall around it. But the sacred space of the temple was not just about a diffuse divine presence. It carried layers of narrative that shaped the imagination of those who entered there to pray. The God of the sanctuary was the same God who had rescued the people from slavery in Egypt and given them the law. The God of the sanctuary was also the creator God. Through the daily liturgies of the temple throughout the year, commanded in the law, the life of the temple participated in the divine law sustaining the universe. According to Josephus, there was a large tapestry of the cosmos hanging over the entrance to the inner court of the temple. And it was in this sacred space that sins and uncleanness could be absolved. This could be the accumulated sins of the people laid by the high priest once a year on the back of a scapegoat to carry them out into the desert. Or it could be personal cleansing or propitiation, animal sacrifices to absolve from impurity or to atone for personal transgression. The cleansing power of the temple is vividly imaged in a vision of Ezekiel. The prophet sees a spring coming from the temple's side, turning into a river and flowing into the desert. Trees fruit all year round, and healing plants grow on its banks. And when it enters the Dead Sea, it makes the waters sweet. Sin and impurity are clearly major elements in the self-awareness of people at the time of Jesus, along with the fear of punishment either in this world or the hereafter. That was as true outside the Jewish world as within it, and is one of the reasons that Judaism and Christianity attracted non-Jews. For most Jews of Jesus' time, the world of the temple and the language and practices of sacrifice provided a tangible way of righting relationships that had gone wrong between God and his people. Christians tapped into the sensibilities of temple spirituality as they developed their account of who Jesus was. The letter to the Hebrews does this explicitly. It takes as its starting point the familiar religious understanding focused on the temple, and step by step transfers all the elements of that religious sensibility to the person of Jesus. The high priest and the sacrifices of the temple are types. They foreshadow what Jesus will accomplish. He is now the true high priest and the true sacrifice who brings a definitive reconciliation with God in the true temple, God's dwelling place in heaven. The sense of sin or deficiency before God is clearly a significant feature of the inner life of Jesus' followers. Like followers of the Stoic philosophical school, they were challenged to be aware of their inner states, to have sensitive consciences. It was an aspect of the disposition of humility called for when entering prayer. And it is the reason why followers of Jesus are commanded not to judge one another. But this sense of unworthiness before God turns out to be the disposition necessary for a genuine experience of grace. The experience of grace and forgiveness resonates through the writings of Paul, as he describes his own experience of being a forgiven sinner, and as he tries to mediate that same experience to his audience. And he finds that grace in a living relationship with the person of Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, whom he has encountered in the Spirit. Thus, Jesus himself becomes the focus of Christian prayer, worshipped as God. Christians encounter transcendence through him, experience communication with him, experience liberation and forgiveness in him, though perhaps not all Christians to the same degree. As Matthew indicates at the end of his Gospel, and as John indicates throughout his, not all followers of Jesus are prepared to worship him directly. This leads into another aspect of the Christian experience, the presence of the Spirit in many Christian communities, and the importance of charismatic prayer and communal worship. This has an existential aspect, but also implies a working theory of the relationship between God, human persons, and the cosmos. Conceptually, the language of the Spirit of God makes a bridge between the Stoic cosmology and theology familiar to the wider Hellenistic world and the narrative language of the Jewish scriptures. The Spirit of God is celebrated as a creative, life-giving force in the Psalms. It is the power that comes upon the prophets, enabling them to speak in the name of God. And the Spirit of God accompanies David, chosen as Messiah. In Stoic cosmology, the divine intelligent spirit ran through the whole of creation in the elements of wind and fire, and was shared in some way by all intelligent beings. Christians and Pharisees, in contrast to the Sadducees, both accepted the Spirit as a reality in the world, a divine power that entered the human self and enabled communication with God and prophetic speech. But if the Spirit as a bridge concept helped make Christianity comprehensible to the wider world, the experience of prayer in the Spirit made it attractive as well. Paul's first letter to the Christians at Corinth gives a sense of how impressed new Christians were by charismatic gifts, particularly glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. Paul uses very Stoic language to explain how one Spirit animates the whole body of believers with different gifts. But he has to remind them that the most useful gifts are not necessarily the spectacular ones. What benefits the community is more important. Prophetic words, teaching, interpreting scriptures. Above all, the personal transformation that enables a person to live a life characterized by love. This does not stop him in a later letter speaking of his own spectacular experience of being snatched up into the third heaven and seeing sights and sounds that cannot be described. We can see there how contemporary cosmology affects the language in which the experience is articulated. And clearly not all Christian communities were equally enthusiastic about life in the Spirit. Matthew's Gospel and the letter of James seem to be speaking to people who are more comfortable with worship tied to word and action than charismatic ecstasy. Part of the reason for this is perhaps the ambiguity of charismatic discourse. Another strand of contemporary Jewish theology found in the Qumran text emphasized that there were other spirits at work beside the Spirit of God. This clearly posed a problem of trust, particularly when members of the community speaking in the Spirit came up with startling new theological claims. The letters of John are written to charismatic communities who have false prophets in their midst. Like Paul and his Corinthians, he has to rein them in. Before the charismatic words of a prophet or preacher are accepted, the spirits must be tested. The tests turn out to be the two narrative claims that will define mainstream Christian theology. For Paul, the Spirit must profess that Jesus is Lord. For John, the Spirit must profess that Jesus Christ came from God in the flesh. Central to the spirituality of Christians is a living relationship with the crucified and risen Lord. And that is the starting point for understanding distinctively Christian theology. The experience of Jesus of Nazareth as Christ, Redeemer, and Son of God.